So we're really happy to have Tandem here. We've had a number of Tandem trainings here at First Five, and happy to have Kelsey Gottschalk back to do a training for us today. And she's the program supervisor for San Francisco's Tandem Partners in Early Learning program. Over the last 6 years, she has developed and provided workshops for hundreds of families, early childhood educators, and family support professionals on a variety of child development topics, ranging from bilingual language development to trauma's effects on the young brain. As co-chair of Tandem's Curriculum Steering Committee, she manages internal systems for the creation and revision of training curriculum in response to new developments in research and changing community needs. She also sits on the Professional Development and Community Learning Committee of the San Francisco Family Support Network, helping to schedule a diverse and relevant menu of training experiences for family support professionals. Kelsey has presented trainings at statewide and regional conferences hosted by California Association for Bilingual Education and California Association for the Education of Young Children and First Five California. Prior to working at Tandem, Kelsey lived and worked in Ecuador as an English teacher and legal and medical interpreter. Kelsey, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate this opportunity for us to be able to start talking about the tough stuff. And I will be monitoring the chat or monitoring as questions come in at different points. And we'll take it away, Kelsey. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Beth. It is so great to be here. I'm so honored that all of you have decided to spend your morning with me today. I am really excited to get started. So I am here, as Beth said, from Tandem, Partners in Early Learning. And it looks like we have not disabled the annotate feature. So let's go ahead and do that. Yeah. All right. As some of you may know, Tandem is focused on supporting children ages 0 to 5 through the adults closest to them in their lives. We've got 2 different types of programming. The first one, Story Cycles, is a program that runs through preschool and childcare centers. We're in 850 classrooms across Alameda, Contra Costa, and San Francisco counties. Our books are multilingual and multicultural, and each week, every student takes home a bag of books to read with their family, and then brings them back the following week, and then another child gets those books. At least that's how it worked before COVID-19. But we also know that a lot of kids are not in formal childcare, and so we provide this early learning everywhere programming, supporting training for educators, for family support professionals, also providing direct services to families, play groups, literacy events, workshops for families. You can see some pictures of our Literacy Day at Fairyland on there on the slide. So that's an overview of the many different ways that we approach our work, but the goal is really to support all the adults who are spending a lot of time with little kids. So today we are talking about the tough stuff, addressing trauma with young children and their families. And we have, this workshop is typically a full day. And so I zoomed it out and converted it into a shorter overview that's going to be digestible over Zoom training. But we do have a lot of things to cover. So we're going to start with just looking at traumatic experiences and trauma and how those affect young children and their families. And then we're going to take a look at and practice some concrete strategies that we can use in the moment when a child or an adult or ourselves are panicking. Also developing the emotional grounding skills and also the brain strength that we need over time to build resilience to trauma. And then finally, we're going to look at specific strategies for how to look back at something really scary or hard that happened for a child and start to approach unpacking that in a way that feels safe for that child. And then finally, we're going to pivot to really focusing on our work with adults and how we can communicate some of these things with families and parents who may have experienced trauma as well, in a way that is supportive and really honoring their strengths. So a little bit more housekeeping. Leah covered the main points, but especially for anybody who joined a little later, please do keep yourself muted. We also may mute you if we're hearing some background noise. The hosts are able to do that. But we do invite you to show your video if you feel comfortable. We're all adults here, so feel free to make your own call on that. Oh, I forgot to, there it is, mic off, video on. As long as you're comfortable, this is not a webinar. I really want it to be a training and a workshop, and that means that I really can't do it without your input and your participation. So thank you so much for being here and being present with us. If now that all these videos are popping on, if you're starting to lose track of me, you can scroll along the bar on the top of your screen. And if you click the 3 dots on the top right of my video, you can spotlight my video and that will put me at the front. If you pin my video, that might actually replace the PowerPoint and then you won't be able to see it. But if you spotlight it, that should work. And if you have any issues with that, feel free to type in the chat and hopefully Leah or Beth can help you troubleshoot. The chat, which I just briefly mentioned, is where we're going to be doing a lot of our input. I really wish that we could just unmute everybody and have a conversation, but with 131 of us, that would be a little challenging. So the chat box should be on the right side of your screen. If you don't see it, then on the bottom of your screen, you should have a black bar with an option to click on the chat icon, which looks a little bit like that blue shape on my screen. And then finally, raising your hand. If you click on that same black bar on the bottom, next to the icon you clicked for chat, there should be an icon with little stick figures on it that says participants. And if you click on participants, you should have the option to raise your hand. It's a little blue hand that says raise hand. So of course I can see a few of your videos and some of you could raise your hand and I would see you, but it's much easier for me to see everyone if you're able to raise your hand. Carolina's doing it, thank you. Anybody else? Stephen found the blue raised hand. So if you go on your screen, you can virtually raise your hand with a blue raised hand. There we go. I'm seeing lots of hands raised. All right, we're getting closer. If you haven't found it yet, you can. Oh, we've got somebody who got unmuted. Okay. All right, thank you for muting again. Okay, so we've got about a third of us, I think, who have the hands raised. If you're having trouble finding it, please feel free to type in the chat and troubleshoot that as well with Beth and or Leah. All right, so moving right along, let's get started. I would love to know who all is in this room. And so we're going to start with a quick poll, which is going to have a question about how you identify in your relationship to young children. And it's a multiple choice poll, so you can choose more than one answer. If you're a parent and an educator and a grandparent, you're welcome to check all of those boxes. And so the poll should be coming up any minute now. There you go. So go ahead and click the boxes on that poll. All right. Got a lot of responses. If you don't know what an FCC owner is, you probably aren't one. but for the record, that's a family child care center owner. Oh, we've got one. Okay, we've got almost 100 people who've already responded. Seeing a pretty widespread: parents, grandparents, a lot of early childhood educators, family support professionals, case managers. I think right now the winner with 54% is early childhood educator. Very cool. Okay. So there are the results. We've got a whole lot of parents in the room, also family support professionals and early childhood educators. All right, thank you all so much for participating in that poll. And the next question that I have for you, I would like you to answer in the chat. Can you type the name of the agency or nonprofit organization or childcare or school that you work for or that you're most closely associated with? And go ahead and drop those into the chat. Got a few Tandemites and seeing Bananas, YMCA, Roots. Awesome. We've got a really, really wide range of people looking out for
This is Beth. There's wonderful groups of folks here. School districts, it's really wonderful.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for sharing a little bit about who you are. And now that I got a sense of who I'm talking to, I'm going to close this poll so I can see you all. And let's get into it. So I've got one more chat question for you all before I start talking. And I would just like you to type into the chat some of the things that come to mind for you when you hear the word trauma. What does that make you think of? And Beth, if you could read some of those out, that would be awesome.
Sure will.
Thanks.
Pain, a lot of saying pain, sadness, anger, suffering, horrible experience, stress, dysregulation, lost, overwhelm, suffering, unexpected violence, stress, fracture to the soul. Oh, that's good. Suffering, grief, abuse, neglect, depression, scared, big and small, terrible experience, frustration, overthinking, fear, ongoing, difficult to get over, ripple effect, stress, one-time event, dehumanization, suffering, stress, unhappy, heartbreak, anger, useful, anxiety, worry, unable to concentrate, violence, sadness, pain, scared, numb, mental scarring, loss, betrayal, lost child, broken heart, rage, pressure, heartbreak, withdrawal, scared, rape, loss of innocence. Very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you all so much. It's very difficult hearing all of those words read out like that. I wasn't actually expecting that. And that does remind me that, you know, this is a workshop about trauma, and some things may come up that are difficult to talk about or even difficult to hear. And I just want to reiterate that I really encourage everyone to take care of themselves. If you need a break, there's no shame in turning off your video for a second, walk away for a little bit. We will take one break in the middle of the training. And we'll have a number of opportunities throughout the training for questions, where I'll pause at the end of each section and we can have a little Q&A. But if you feel the need at any other time to step away for a little while, please, you're more than welcome to do that. take care of yourselves first. All right, so those were a lot of really, really relevant words associated with trauma. And for the purposes of this workshop today, this is the definition that we're going to work with. Trauma is the name for changes to the brain that happen after experiences of danger, violence, or significant loss cause overwhelming emotions that aren't quickly soothed. And I think a lot of times when we think about what trauma is, we think about those experiences of danger, violence, or significant loss. But actually, when we look at this definition, the words that I want to draw out are changes to the brain, overwhelming emotions, and they aren't quickly soothed. So that concept, somebody wrote mental scarring, that concept that actually the wiring and the chemistry of your brain is changed by an event. It could be an event that was sudden and unexpected. Some people used those words, unexpected violence. It could come out of nowhere and be just really huge. Or it could be a slow drip, drip over time of something that just isn't right, that doesn't go away. And both of these things can lead to a human brain actually changing. And the brain can change in ways that cause health challenges over time. But again, it's important to remember that the event itself is not a trauma. So an event could be traumatic for one child. A brother and sister could be in the same car accident, and the brother could be traumatized by it and the sister might not. If you think about a 4-foot-high wave in the ocean, I'm about 6 feet tall and I love to swim in the ocean. So I might not even notice a 4-foot-high wave when I'm swimming. But if I were a 3-foot-tall toddler, then that would be a really different situation for me, right? So that wave is the same event, but it's going to affect different people in different ways. And for some people, it might drag you under, and for other people, it might not. And when it comes, that's a metaphor. When it comes to trauma, it has nothing to do with your height, just to be clear. But there are real differences in the way that we perceive different events that happen. So when we're talking about trauma today, we're really focusing on those changes to the brain. So what are those changes to the brain? This is a very simplified depiction of 3 layers of the human brain. And at the very core, we have what we call the reptilian brain, which is the part of the brain that we share with lizards and snakes. And it tells us, you're in danger, get safe. Fight, flight, freeze. We hear that a lot, right? That's the part of the brain that keeps our lungs pumping and keeps our heart beating and keeps us alive. The next layer, oh, and one more thing I should say about the reptilian part of the brain is it does not learn things. It is there to make us function. It doesn't learn new information. The blue part of the brain is a little bit more complex. That's the part that we share with other mammals and also encompasses the limbic system. And that's where our brain processes emotions. And it is helpful to teach us that we want to avoid things that make us feel sad and angry and look for things that will make us feel better. But it's also not the smartest, right? It's the part of our brain that's like, I feel terrible, I should eat all of this ice cream, when, maybe that's not ultimately the best choice for our long-term well-being. And so when we want to look at those long-term cost-benefit analysis, cognitive, critical thinking decisions, that's when we look to the green part of the brain, which here is called the human part of the human brain. It is the part that makes us unique. And that is the cerebral cortex. And that part of the brain is somewhat like steering the rest of it, right? And we're going to look in a second at an example of a jockey on a horse. So we can think of that human brain as the jockey. So what happens when we get really emotional? All of our resources rush to the reptilian and the mammalian brain. When we get an emotional response to something, those emotion and survival centers go on overdrive, and there's no time or energy for thinking slowly through the cost benefit analysis. We're in survival mode and we need to act right now. Now, the fact that the brain does that for us when we're really scared is what allows us to stay alive. It's what allows you to jump out of the way if you see a car coming. But if there's no car coming and your brain gets into that mode and gets stuck in that mode, then you start to see problems, because the core center of your brain is running the show. You're not going to be making your best decisions. And that upper green part of your brain, especially for a young child, and this is why trauma can be so devastating for young children, is that upper part of your brain needs to be used in order to develop properly. And we know that young children have really rapid neural firing and brain development happening in those first 5 years. And so when really young children get stuck in this emotional survival place, they're not going to be experiencing the same normal development of all of these language skills and critical thinking and early math and executive functioning, which we'll talk about a little bit later. All of these things that human brain portion, the cerebral cortex, needs to be engaged in order to develop. And so then what can happen? Well, one thing that can happen is that they can become, when children have been in this place of the reptilian and mammalian brain for too long, they can become hypervigilant. If you think of a child who is living in a tent on a sidewalk, and that child has learned that loud noises mean absolute imminent danger, stay alive, then put that child in a classroom now, and somebody drops a book on the floor. Their brain is going to react to that loud noise in the way that it has learned, because the brain has learned what it needs to know to stay safe most of the time. And so this is the thing, when, you know, these reptilian and mammalian brain help us in a crisis situation, but they become a real problem in a non-crisis situation. So going back to that metaphor of the reptile brain being like a horse and a human brain being like the rider on the horse, what we call a trigger is something like that book dropping. It's something that happens where we're still safe, but it sets something off in our brain that sends us back to that overactivity in the core of our brain that tells us you're not safe, you're about to die, fight, flight, freeze. And that could look a lot of different ways, right? We can react to that in a lot of different ways. And the people around us might see us reacting to something that doesn't bother anyone else and not have a very gentle or kind reaction in receiving what's going on for us, right? So if we think about this horse, let's say that this horse, as a young colt, was trotting along and saw a snake and got bit by a snake and was lying there in pain for hours until someone found the horse and was able to dress the wound. Now, 5 years later, the horse is running along with a rider and sees a stick that looks just like the snake. The horse is not gonna be like, oh, I wonder what that is. Could it be a snake? No, the horse is reacting, and the horse bucks the rider and runs off. Okay, so now let's be the rider. What is something that we could do to get the horse to come back to us? Is it hold up the stick and be like, you're stupid, this is not a snake, come back here? Is that going to bring the horse back? And no. So let's type a couple ideas in the chat. What do we do to bring back the horse? What are some of the things that we, as the rider, need to say or do or be in order to bring that horse back to us so that we can get on our way again?
Talk softly, be calm, talk soothingly, Use a gentle voice. Use soothing words. Reassure the horse that you understand and that it's safe. Be kind. Be calming and give comfort.
Those are a lot of really, really good
Acknowledge.
examples.
Yeah.
Acknowledge.
Petting the horse. Petting the horse.
And so if that horse has run off, I am not going to be able to run after it. So what do I have to do to get the horse to come back?
Wait.
Mm-hmm.
Talk with a calm voice and be loving. Rubbing its back. Be patient.
Okay. So let's put a pin in this horse metaphor, and we're going to come back to these ideas in just a second. Resilience. Resilience is the good news. Resilience is the ability to cope with stress and take risks and get a little closer to find out if it's a stick or a snake. We're genetically predisposed to how resilient we are. That means we're born with it. Some of us are naturally born more sensitive than others to emotional stimuli, right? Some of us are naturally going to be able to take what comes without getting overwhelmed. And it's that overwhelm that's really the key here. We all get emotional, and emotions are natural, right? We want that limbic system to be working for us. It's when it gets overwhelmed and we lose track of reality that it becomes a problem. So to this genetic predisposition, let's think a little bit about that wave metaphor that I was using before, right? I was talking about how a 3-foot-high toddler could be totally wrecked by a 4-foot wave. However, I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Moana. When she's a 3-foot-high toddler, she's totally unfazed. She's not afraid at all, right? And some of us are just naturally less sensitive to things than others. So with practice and a lot of time, a child can reduce the negative impacts of trauma. I was talking about how trauma is changes to the brain, right? And those are kind of scary changes to the brain. They're changes that we don't want to happen. But the good news is young brains are really changeable for better as well as for worse. That's what we call neuroplasticity, right? That the brain is constantly reacting to the world around it and learning and changing the way it responds. And so the good news is that these things can be changed over time. And the single most important factor for overcoming trauma, statistically, and Nadine Burke-Harris talks about this all the time, is having at least one caring, trusted adult in the child's life. This could be a biological parent, a relative, a neighbor. It could be a teacher. It could be a mental health professional. As long as there is somebody there that cares about the child and that the child trusts, then healing can happen. Now, again, depending on the child, depending on their level of resilience, depending on what they've experienced, how old they are, all of these different factors, some of them may not be able to recover fully without the help of a mental health professional. But for all of us who are early childhood educators and parents and grandparents, there are ways that we can make sure that we're there to support the child, to find ways to cope, to build this resilience, and over time, be able to move through life without being owned by their traumatic experience. So, one last question for the chat box in this section. As a community, as parents and grandparents and educators and family support providers and mental health professionals, what do we want our response to be to a young child that's been through a traumatic experience? This little baby has been through something really challenging, but has an amazing community of people caring for him. So what do we want our response as a community to look like?
Love and patience. Nurture. I am with you. Support. acceptance, love, empathy, communication, presence, touch and attunement, reassurance, be available, encouraging, patience, friendliness, active listening, love and hope, prayers, interactive response, feeling safe, hugs, love, consistency, a safe place, caring, encouraging, prayers, respect, safety, stability, loving. Food always soothes the soul. I like. Keep calm and connect to the child. Always check in with them and have tools that you know calms them down, and be present. Oh, not a lot of knowing people in the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really, really beautiful. And I love that there are a lot of common themes, but also we're getting a lot of different words. There are a lot of different ways of thinking about and approaching this kind of community care. So what does trauma look like? Right? We might get tantrums coming seemingly out of nowhere, right? A child hears a loud noise and then suddenly flies into a panic, right? Or maybe it's not a loud noise. Maybe it's the color yellow. It's a certain shade of yellow. Triggers are really, really challenging because they're going to be different for every child or adult, every person who's experienced trauma. Triggers are going to look different, and they're going to have different levels of intensity depending on what happened and depending on the resilience. We might also see violence toward others, that fight response, right? So even though the child doesn't need to defend themselves for their lives, their brain is telling them they have to. Oh, and also the next photo I'm about to show is pretty disturbing. So trigger warning for that. Feel free to look away or until the end of the slide if it's an image of a child who's been in a war. The freeze response. This is really, really important because it's the one that most often goes unnoticed. Totally shutting down. Sometimes when our brains get completely overwhelmed, rather than scream and fight, we just can't anymore. And it's really, really important for us. Somebody mentioned tools that you know work with a child, and we're going to talk about that more later. We're going to go over some strategies and tools. When we're thinking about this trauma, it's so important to know the child that you're working with, because we also know that these behaviors aren't exclusively, it's not like a child throws a tantrum. It's like, oh, they must have been traumatized, right? Children throw tantrums. But often when they do, or if a child in a classroom is hitting or kicking, or if a child is refusing to participate, or if you ask a child a question and they're just ignoring you, what as humans is the adult's common first reaction coming from our reptilian and mammalian brain? If I go to a child and ask them a question and they ignore me, or if I see a child just melting down in the grocery store and we've got somewhere to be, is it going to be the same as all of those things that we typed in the chat earlier? So
People are
that's,
saying,
yeah, go ahead, Beth.
yeah, sorry, people are saying no,
Yeah. Right.
I wanted to mention
go ahead.
that we had an email earlier that asked about bedwetting, which is a behavior that can result from current situation, even now with the COVID-19 and all the changes. But that is also a behavior that could, not necessarily, but is a regressive behavior that could possibly be related to some kind of trauma. But yeah, on our poor parents these days that are so stressed, and we are all so stressed, of course it's going to take a lot of effort to not jump into that reptilian brain and start yelling, yeah, the people are, they're right on with what they're saying.
Yes. Yeah. And exactly, because all of this stuff we've been talking about with kids is also true of adults. This is how the brain works, no matter how old you are. And so the challenge is being able to use your cerebral cortex to tell your core emotional and survival centers of your brain, it's okay. We're not in danger. Thank you for your service, but I don't need you to do that right now. And that's something that not all adults have mastered. Well, virtually no one has mastered, right? And it's something that,
yeah, and it depends on the day.
Yes, absolutely. And the circumstance, right? Things catch us by surprise, and it can be really, really hard to self-regulate, to bring that emotional reaction back down. And it's even harder for children because it's all new. What even is this feeling? And how do I even explain it, right? And we teach children, well, when someone does something nice, you feel happy. And when someone does something mean, you feel sad. But what if you feel sad for no reason? That's a really, really common thing that happens. It's not for no reason, but there are invisible reasons that these things happen. And children often don't get the benefit of learning about that until much later in life. So the key here, going back to the question of behaviors, right? We all talked about, when you think about a child who's traumatized, you think about how you want to respond to that child. It's different from thinking of a child who's hitting and melting down. The response to that child naturally is different. And so then we have to challenge ourselves to realize it's the same child, right? And so when a child has unresolved trauma, they're not just acting out for no reason. They're certainly not trying to spite you, but their brain is trying to help them survive. Their brain is trying to keep them alive. That's what's happening, whether or not their brain is misguided in that effort. And so their difficult behavior is actually a coping mechanism that they've learned. So when we share this knowledge with other adults, it helps us all to see the child behind the behavior. And then we can start to become detectives and look for these patterns. Is it the color yellow that seems to set them off? Is it loud noises? What is it for this individual child that is unbearable, that sets their brain back to a place where it feels like they're in mortal danger? And so I want to recognize that not all children have experienced trauma. They've all experienced stress, and then the stress goes away. It's when that stress stays too long because there isn't a caring adult who's able to calm it. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a caring adult. A child could have very, very caring parents who are also completely overwhelmed with trauma and not in a place where they are humanly able to co-regulate and to support the child to reduce that stress. And that's where entire families who have been through something extremely difficult may need outside adult support. And so when we see children behaving this way, it's also worth acknowledging they don't all have trauma. But the good news is that the strategies, whether a child is traumatized or not, are all the same. Because even if a child has not experienced trauma, the behaviors that they're exhibiting are testing boundaries. It's their job to figure out what is and isn't okay in the world. And in both cases, our job is to teach what is and isn't okay in the world. So we've covered a lot of ground. I want to pause for a little bit for questions. You can type into the chat if you'd like, or if you feel like you'd rather ask verbally, you can go ahead and raise your hand and we will unmute you. But these are the topics that we've talked about so far, and I would love to hear if you've got any questions.
Sometimes it takes a minute. Someone is asking, can you talk a bit more about resilience?
Yes. What
Someone
would
is
you like
asking
to
if,
know?
yeah, and this session will be recorded. Yes, we are going to record this session, and we will be sending the link out to folks post-training.
So can you give me a little bit more in terms of what you'd like to know about resilience? Do you have a specific question?
Let's see, what are they saying? It's from Sylvia. Sylvia, is there something more specifically? Oh, she says how to build resilience.
Ah, good. Yes. So we are going to go in the next section into really specific strategies for this, but primarily the idea behind building resilience is supporting the cerebral cortex, that green part of the brain, which isn't green in real life. I just realized that sounded weird. But that cerebral cortex that's driving the whole thing, supporting the development of certain skills, including the ability to stop and start and recognize your emotions and control what you're doing. And we can develop a lot of those skills through games and through simple conversations in times of non-stress. Whereas those strategies will not work as well when a child is in that moment of overwhelm because that cerebral cortex is not functioning, right? So the strategies that we're going to be talking about later, we're going to start with in the moment of total panic. How do you just bring us back down into now and into reality? And then we'll talk about some specific supports and games and conversational techniques that we can use with kids when they feel safe and calm to help them be able to recognize on a smaller scale, oh, that doesn't feel good. And this is what I'm going to do to feel better, and really thinking through those things in a more controlled way. So yeah, I think that's an overview, and we'll get into some details in the second section. And if you have more questions, you can ask after that.
That sounds good.
Any other questions?
Yes, there's someone had asked about how it seems, someone had an observation that it seems like more and more children have challenging behaviors. And does this mean that more children than ever have experienced trauma? And how do we distinguish? That's a common thing, to distinguish between what is normal developmentally appropriate behavior and what is trauma. And I like what you had said, Kelsey, about in some ways it doesn't matter if it's trauma, like if it's a child new to you, you don't know if it's trauma or if it's developmentally appropriate for this particular child, but the response can be the same of how you are. But anyway, that's an interesting, anything?
Yeah, I would say more children are showing challenging behaviors, I would say, compared to when.
Yeah.
I would say that, you know, it's hard for us to say on a really broad scale more children in general are traumatized because it's such an individual thing. But what I can say is that a lot of children are experiencing a lot of stress right now with this pandemic. Almost, I mean, there is no one who isn't affected by this pandemic in some way.
Yes, yes.
And the things that we're losing, whether it's a loved one or a job or the ability to see my best friend next door who I used to see every day, or to go to school and I don't understand why I can't go. And especially for young children who don't understand why this is happening and don't have a frame of reference for fitting this in. I mean, none of us have a frame of reference. This hasn't happened. Nothing similar to this has happened in over 100 years. So there is a lot of stress right now.
Yes, and it seems to me that a lot of the providers that are on this webinar right now, or this meeting, are protective factors for the children and for the families, being support to the families. Someone asked, how do we encourage parents to seek help without funding them?
Without what?
Without offending them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
we're going to talk, that's section 3. We're going to
great.
get
So
deeper into that too. Yes.
That's great.
That is a really good question. And so, you know, as I was saying before, the last thing I want to say before we break is that this idea of stress versus trauma, right? We all experience stress, but if those children have caring adults who are able to help them support to calm that stress response, or if those caring adults have caring adults to help them to calm that stress response, then these kids are going to be much, much better set up and equipped to build that resilience. So we're going to dive into those details in the next section. I'm glad to hear these questions because it means everybody's at the right training. And there are things that we will be talking about. So before we do that, we are going to take a 5-minute break. And I want to encourage you to get up and move because I spend far too much time in my chair. And as we will see in a little bit, it's really, really good for the body and the brain to stand up from the desk once in a while. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, which means we're going to come back right at 10:56. And I will see everybody then. In the moment strategies. So when a child is having an emotional response, an overwhelming and emotional response, and they're in their reptile brain, the first step, no matter what, even if there's a really no reason, even if it's because they knocked over a tower of blocks and now it's on the floor, in young children who are just learning how the world works, that can be overwhelming, right? So whether it's a real traumatic experience or just the child's normal learning tantrum, the first step before we can do any kind of teaching is we need to bring them back to their more logical human brain. So we're going to talk about a few different ways that we can do that. So what are some of the strategies that you already use to calm children down from a trauma trigger or tantrum? You can go ahead and type in the chat.
It's reminding me of the things people said about the horse too. Hug them, calm them down, talk to them, acknowledge their feelings, use a kind voice, give them space, hum a tune.
A lot of music in there.
Yeah, gently, speak gently, active listening. Let's see, don't interrupt, be loving, talk softly and tell them, tell me what's going on. How can I help? Hold them, rub their backs, talk to them. Let's see, tell them it's going to be okay. Offer a hand to hold, provide sensory materials. I like that, something that's maybe cuddly or soft. Some children like weighted things. Listen when they are ready to talk, and just show them love in various ways. Someone's asking about when they have a tantrum or a trauma that causes when they are in a tantrum that causes injury to another.
Yeah, so that's a really, really important point, is that the first thing when there's violence is we need to keep everybody physically safe, right? And we might need to get involved physically to stop whatever's going on. And there are so many nuances to that that depend on your role and your relationship to that child, right? But the violence needs to stop first, so that no one's going to get injured. Once we've achieved that, a child that has stopped punching and throwing things, just because they've stopped punching and throwing things doesn't mean that they're ready now to like have a conversation about their choices, right? So we want to start by bringing them back into their thinking brain. And as you pointed out, Beth, a lot of those strategies that folks mentioned were really similar to the strategies that we had for calming down a horse, because the child is in their animal brain right?
Mm.
And so on the left side of these slides, you're going to see in blue a kind of shorthand for what this technique might look like for adults. And then on the right side, you'll see some pictures of what this technique might look like for children. So the breath is really, really important. And we know that when we get really anxious and stressed and overwhelmed, we start to breathe faster. We start to have shorter breaths. And so we can kind of reverse engineer calmness by breathing calmly, and it sends a signal to the brain that it's okay to be calm. And it just chemically works. And so this is a really, really key strategy that it seems almost so simple that it's easy to discard, but it's really, really powerful. And so if you look online, look up 4-7-8 breaths online, you'll find the community of people who say that those are the magic numbers and that's the most important thing. So I used that example because it is a good one, but the key idea is to slow the breath down, to breathe deeply, not into the chest, but into the abdomen, and often to breathe out for longer than you're breathing in. So let's try for about 3 breaths doing this 4 counts in, hold for 7, and then 8 counts out. So I'm going to count us through this. And if you can sit with both feet on the ground, roll your shoulders back, find a place where you're comfortable. And we're going to take a breath in for 1, 2, 3, 4, hold, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Again, in, 2, 3, 4, hold. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and out. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That was 2. We're going to do one more. In, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and out. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So when you go back to breathing normally, you should find that your breath has naturally slowed down significantly. And in a moment of extreme stress, that is a really powerful tool. And that's something that we can walk other adults through. It's something that my friends do with me when I'm overwhelmed. And it's something that some kids are going to be able to do as well. We could walk a child through that as well and practice counting. But for really, really young ones, there are a few other strategies pictured here. I use that one on the bottom, sniffing the flower and blowing the bubble, just in a classroom when kids are excited and having fun, but it's getting like out of control because there are 25 of them. I'll ask everybody to pick a flower and smell it. And with their other hand, get a bubble wand and blow a bubble. And that visual can really help them to get the concept. And then you're not telling them to breathe slower, but you're actually giving them a kind of game to play. Also, if you happen to have a pinwheel, getting a child to blow so that they can spin the pinwheel, that's really nice. And then another great one, which one of my colleagues just used with her 4-year-old the other day, and she said it was like a miracle, is this picture on the top right where these little guys have stuffies on their tummies and they're laying down and they're practicing raising up and lowering the stuffy like an elevator. And that really gets them breathing down into their deep lungs. And that is very, very calming. And that can really support the brain to come back to reality. So in addition to the breathing, anything that reminds us of where we are physically in space, that we're calling here sensory activities, is also really powerful for taking us out of the story of whatever it is that we're really upset about, right? It's like, yes, and it doesn't mean that anger or the sadness is not justified. It doesn't mean that I don't need to be angry. It's just this mental skill to be able to realize I am very angry and I'm also okay here now, physically in space, right? And so one strategy that's really great for adults is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where you look around yourself and just notice 5 things you can see. So hand sanitizer, book, water bottle, computer, phone. And then 4 things that you can feel. I can feel the headphones pressing on my head. I can feel my sleeves on my arms. I can feel my chair under me, and I can feel the floor under my feet. 3 things that you can hear. I hear a general electronic buzz. I hear my own voice. And I hear a little bit of traffic outside, right? So you kind of have to like slow yourself down and pay attention. And then 2 things you can smell is actually going to force you to take a couple of breaths in. The 2 things that you can smell is actually the hardest one for me to identify. I don't think I have a great sense of smell. If you can't come up with a name for what you're smelling, that's okay. That's not the point, right? So don't beat yourself up for that. And then finally, one thing that you can taste, which is just kind of the resting taste in your mouth that may or may not be pleasant, but that we just don't think about very often. And it brings us back to where we are. For kids, anything that is interesting in terms of how it feels, or just asking them to name, if they're verbal, right? The 2 kids on the bottom here are probably not verbal yet, but asking them to name a color around them, or playing something really quiet, say, can you hear that? Right? It's going to kind of shock their brain into like, oh, okay, no, the world isn't actually ending. The world is still here right now. So making use of those 5 senses is really, really powerful. And finally, movement. And I'm going to ask you all to join me in some movement if you are willing and able to stand up.
A ton of room here. Okay. All right. So we are going to practice some cross-body movements. When you do anything that's moving your right side across your left side, it's actually supporting a really specific area of your brain called the corpus callosum, which it lives in the human part of the brain, and it connects your left and right brain. And this is a very simple physical way of stimulating it, which helps it to develop. It tends to be underdeveloped in young children, and especially in children or adults who have experienced trauma. So you can try kicking your legs without kicking your desk, side to side, anything that feels good. There's no right or wrong way to do this. And then if we just do any kind of stretching, that's going to force you to slow down your breath. It's very hard to hyperventilate and stretch at the same time. So that's another, all of these things with the sensory and the movement, they all end up coming back to the breath. So now I would invite you to choose one of these babies. And this is one of my favorites. You can, all of these babies have some great cross-body movements going on. So you can feel free to choose one and try out some of their dance moves. Let's see. The ones on the bottom are intimidating to me. Like, I don't know if I can do that, but especially without making a huge noise for the neighbors downstairs, but I like this one. All right. Thank you all for humoring me. I see at least a few videos and everybody I'm looking at got up, so I appreciate that. All right. That's stressed.
But I hope that was helpful in the moment. Oh, we have some people thought it was super fun. I'm glad to hear that. Felt so good. Yay. Yeah, we don't move enough. We always forget how much that matters. All right. So one more in the moment strategy, which of course depends again on your space and what your interaction with children is like, works really well in a classroom or in a home, is having a place that is safe where that child cannot be bothered. And it's got to be always, always optional. That's the difference between a safe space and a timeout. It can never be like, you're in trouble, go to your safe space. That's not safe. Creating a place that the child maybe helps to decorate, where they really feel safe and cozy and in their own world, and they can choose to go there when they need to in order to calm down, can be really, really helpful. Especially in a home where you've got a lot of people in close quarters. I'm speaking from personal experience, that can be really, really challenging, even if you super like the people that you're living with. And so have a box, you know, a refrigerator box. It can be that simple, where the child can choose to go when they need some space. And in terms of building resilience, building an understanding of when we need space, being able to say, I'm not in a good place to talk to you about this. I'm too angry right now to have this conversation. I need some time alone first, is really, really challenging and important skill to develop for adults and children. Okay, so now we're getting into building resilience in the longer term. How can we help children learn to calm themselves down and to regulate their own behaviors? So we talked about those first examples are often called co-regulation, where we suggest something along with the child because they're not in a place mentally to come up with it necessarily on their own. And so we sit with them and co-regulate them to bring them back down to earth. But then how can we set them up for success later on? Maybe when we're not physically there to support. One thing is having the words, building the vocabulary to talk about what they're feeling. So one thing is learning the basic vocabulary: happy, excited, surprised, sad, frightened, angry. What's the difference between those things? You can see in the middle picture, this is a little guy that we worked with who was showing us what fear looks like. He's standing up in front of the miedo or fear poster and demonstrating what that feels like in the body. And also encouraging kids to use any other language about trying to think about how it feels in the body. There's a knot in my stomach, or my chest feels hot, right? Or it feels like my feet are made of stone, right? Those kinds of things that we can associate with feeling words start to help children recognize, I know what's happening to my body. I can relate it back to this, and I know how to make it feel better. Somebody just mentioned giving them permission to explore and verbally state their feelings. I had a child in a classroom one time tell me that when he feels scared, it feels like trucks are driving in his brain, which I found surprisingly relatable. So there are a lot of different ways and words that we can use to talk about these things. Environmental supports, routine. So important for kids. A lot of times they act like they don't want it, but they do. And knowing what comes next is so comforting, especially when it's against the backdrop of uncertainty. And uncertainty can be so overwhelming. I mean, that's part of what is so difficult about this pandemic that we're living in, is nobody has an end date really clearly in mind. No one's really sure what's going to happen next. No one's really sure what the right thing to do is. And so a 15-minute timer can be very, very comforting. It's like a known quantity, and I can watch, okay, so, you know, I have to go to bed, but before I go to bed, I'm allowed to play with my toy for 15 more minutes. 15 minutes is an abstract concept. But if we've got a timer where you can actually see the time passing and hear the ding at the end, it might still not be exciting to go to bed, but it is going to be really, really comforting that it doesn't just feel random and arbitrary. Excuse me. Another thing that, you know, a couple of these are pictures of classroom supports where you have the picture schedule on the wall of how the day is going to go. Excuse me. Or you have a picture on the wall of how many kids can be in one physical space at one time, right? And all of these things give children something that they can tether to and understand and know what is coming next. All right. So games. Games are incredibly powerful for building executive function. Executive function is a term we use to talk about basic skills we need in society. They include our impulse control, short-term memory, ability to react appropriately to unexpected changes without totally freaking out. And these skills are often underdeveloped in children who have experienced trauma because they're managed by that cerebral cortex or human brain. We talked about how the human brain can sometimes be underdeveloped if the reptilian brain has been in overdrive for too long or for too often. But executive functioning skills can be developed like a muscle. So if we think about the game of musical chairs, which is not a very COVID-19 friendly game, but it is a good example, and we'll talk about some more examples. If we think about the game of musical chairs, how do children need inhibitory control, which is a type of executive function that tells us I can stop and start when I want to. I can do that or not. I don't have to just go with what I'm feeling. So in playing musical chairs, why is that ability to stop and start something that kids need in order to be successful in the game? As I'm waiting for people to write responses, oh, okay, here's some coming in. Controlling oneself. Yeah, how do you use that in musical chairs? What do you need to stop or start? I am noticing we had a question about a child that becomes anxious when a timer is used. Then don't use a timer. It's really individual. And that goes back to knowing that individual child and what is and isn't going to work for them. But thank you for bringing that up. Thank you for that reminder that not all children respond the same way to these different supports. Be able to stop when the music stops. Music, right? It sets limits. So this game is requiring us to stop when the music stops. And that is building up our ability to control a tantrum, to decide that, you know, there's a limit there. For whatever reason, this thing I feel like doing, I really want to punch that kid, but I'm not going to. That self-control is actually developed in a really safe and fun way without it feeling like a chore or teaching you a lesson, just by playing these games. They build confidence in group cooperation, right? So we have a lot of really good benefits of games coming out through this. Also, working memory. I remember what I was just about to do. When I get interrupted, I can keep going because I know what I was going to do anyway. That is another aspect of executive function. So that working memory is used in musical chairs because you have to remember that not only when the music stops, you have to stop, you also have to go find a chair. That's part of the rules. But you've seen those kids, there's always like that kid playing musical chairs who the music stops and they're like, what? And then all the seats are gone, right? Because they've forgotten, like, oh, there was another part to this game. So there are actually quite a few tasks in musical chairs that you have to keep track of. And then finally, it builds mental flexibility. Because what if the music stops and you're running for a chair, and all of a sudden some kid runs faster and swoops your chair. You have to be able to keep calm enough to change your plan, find a new chair quickly, right? And so these are the types of skills that we're developing by playing musical chairs. Somebody mentioned freeze tag and Mother May I. Can we drop into the chat a few more really common children's games that that build executive function? And double points if you can think of one that can be played while social distancing. Simon Says it's a really good example. Yes. Heads up, 7 up. Red light, green light. That's a really good stop-start game. Freeze dance. I love that one. There's also a song that I used to love as a kid that was you walk and you walk and you walk and stop. And you walk and you walk and you walk and stop. And then it'll be gallop and then it'll be float. And it's all these different things. It's a really fun movement dance game that just gives you the clearest instructions and builds all of these executive functioning skills. So it's a good game for early freeze dancers as they're learning how that game works. Hide and seek, duck, duck, goose. Yes, so these are all things that we think of as silly kids games that are used to fill the time when I forgot to make a long enough lesson plan, but actually they are really, really powerful for building up the executive functioning, which happens in the prefrontal cortex, which is part of the cerebral cortex. We can also modify games to be inclusive and to create a sense of safety for children who need additional supports. So that's important, right? Some kids might not find timers comforting. They might find them anxiety inducing. Some kids might not have their confidence built up by playing group games because they're struggling with their executive function. So they're always that kid that doesn't get the chair, right? So we want to keep an eye out for that and decide what's a game where a child is going to be successful enough and it's at a level that they can understand where they're building their skills and confidence, not just reinforcing the fact that they lack those skills and becoming less confident. So that's the line that we want to walk when we're working with children in this way. Oh my gosh, we have so many different games. Some of them I haven't even heard of. I don't know Night at the Museum at all. Going on.
Makes me want to write a book or have people put them together in a book.
You know? Yeah, that's what I'm going to say about that. And now my computer is going to freeze for just a second, but it'll be back. All right. So building resilience. Those are ways that we can support the brain development and the ability to manage their own emotions of young children. Now, getting to that question that somebody brought up earlier, what if a child has been through something truly terrifying and they seem to have developed resilience and they're just kind of okay most of the time? Do we want to go there? Do we want to bring it up and talk about it or not? I can't unfortunately give a blanket answer to that question because every child is an individual and I am not a qualified mental health professional to decide when it is and isn't appropriate to get into processing trauma for a child in a really direct way, right? That might be something that you need a mental health professional's support and guidance on whether to do it and how to do it. The processing trauma that we're going to be talking about here is a way to start testing the waters as a parent or as a provider or an educator who's concerned and is wondering whether that mental health support is needed or whether this is something that's safe to talk about. And the key here is finding ways to talk about the trauma that creates distance between the experience and the child themselves. And so there are a few different tools that we can use for that. We're going to focus on puppets, books, and art, right? There are so many benefits to using these as tools for supporting kids who are going through or who have experienced some kind of trauma. And the first one is what I mentioned, it creates that safe distance. The child can look in the book and say, oh, she's feeling really, really sad because she feels alone. And we could ask the child, well, what do you think she should do? And now we're not asking the child about how alone they felt, or one moment, my power went out. Okay, we're back. We're not asking the child directly about something really scary that happened to them, so that we're avoiding this really direct reference to something that might be triggering and might send them back into a place of regression or of being out of control. Instead, we're focusing forward, and we're focusing on putting the child in control of a narrative that could be similar to what they've experienced, but it's happening to somebody else. And the benefit of doing that is that a child might actually start to rewire the brain in a positive way by being able to talk about loneliness and recognize it as something that is universal and that doesn't have to take over your life, and that there are ways of managing it. And not only that, the child gets to make up the ending of the story. So for those of you who've already downloaded the handouts for this workshop, we actually have a handout that goes along with this slide that I'm talking about here. It's 3 tips for using books to talk about the tough stuff. And the next 3 bullet points that I'm going to go through are those 3 tips. So the ways that we can use books, and it works the same with puppet play, right? The idea is storytelling with another character, however that wants to look. There are 3 main tools that we can use. Okay, yeah, so if you haven't already gotten the handout, you will receive it emailed to you along with the recording. So you can dive into this a little bit deeper. But effectively, the tools that we can use when we're storytelling is stopping and making some comments about how that character looks like they're feeling. Wow, it looks like when he fell off the swing, he was really scared. And so that could be something that's similar to what the child has experienced or different, but that fear is very universal. And yes, I'm going to show you some books that I recommend in just a second. And so building emotion vocabulary gets back to that building resilience piece we were talking about, where kids are starting to learn the words to talk about what they're going through. And they can learn those words by seeing them in a book. Even if they're not written on the page, we can use them and talk about those characters. Or we can have our puppet, which Mr. Rogers is one of the really famous users of puppets. We can have my friend Gerald say, I feel really sad. And kids can relate to that. And it's kind of silly. And they know it's kind of silly. And so it's relatable without being too close to home. Adults do this all the time. It's called, I'm asking for a friend, right? We say that all the time. That's how we feel more safe, learning the things we need to know for ourselves. Letting the child be the teacher. So not only is the child now talking about that character, talking about their experiences in this kind of position of control, they can also be the one to give the advice. they can say, well, if I were in that situation, this is what I would do, right? Or if that's too close to home, they might say, I think that what he should do is go ask someone for a hug, right? Or whatever it is. But the child can start to coach the characters in the story, and they can even control the ending, right? So even if the book has a prescribed ending, you might stop before the end of the book and allow the child to draw the ending they want it to have. So my colleague Des is going to talk about this a lot in Sharing Stories, Sharing Feelings in our next workshop. So I'm not going to go too much deeper into it, but the biggest key here is thinking about books, puppets, whatever you're using as tools. And that reading every word on the page and finishing the book beginning to end isn't the goal. The goal is to have a conversation in a way that feels safe. So pictures are like mini stories. And often children don't have the vocabulary yet to describe what did happen in a traumatizing experience. And sometimes actually toddlers' memories are non-linear. They're just a mishmash of colors and sounds and smells. So even when they do develop the words, they can't really describe what happened. And drawing is a really powerful way of getting insight into a child's emotional state or what they fear without needing to have a direct conversation. Again, it creates the distance and puts the child in control of the narrative, just like books and puppets, only more so because they have complete control over what goes on this page. So if a child draws this picture and you say, oh, can you tell me more about this picture? And they say, my teddy bear feels sad. My teddy bear don't have mommy. Her mommy's still far away. She don't come back. Her waiting for her mommy. One day come back far away. It's actually got a beginning, middle, and end. What are some of the things that you might say next? Oh, look at that. Someone suggested having children draw pictures. We're on the same page. But what are some things that you might say to this child who shows you this picture and tells you that caption? Give folks some time to start typing. Poor teddy bear. So that's just acknowledging that that's hard. That sounds terrible. That sounds really hard for the teddy bear. That's something that I understand and I have also experienced as a person with feelings. It's really hard to be away from the people you love. Yeah, I can be your friend, teddy bear. So with that, that's really sweet. That's showing support. I'm here because I care and support you, but we want to make sure we're directing it always to the teddy bear, right? So this other question or suggestion, ask if the child understands why mommy is away. Maybe we ask if the teddy bear understands why mommy is away. So we're having this whole conversation with the child, but we're asking for a friend. Oh, teddy bear misses mommy. Just repeating back what you hear is a really good way to validate. That's so sad for Teddy. How can we make the Teddy happy? What would be something nice we could do for Teddy? The answer to that question is going to tell you a lot about what that child needs without putting them on the spot. What would Teddy like to do? Great. So these are a lot of really good responses that are both just validating and showing support for Teddy, and then also asking questions and suggestions about what we could do to help Teddy, who's experiencing this really strong emotion. So our book list. I am going to quickly drop this link also into the chat. I think. No, not wanting to cooperate. Beth or Leah, would you mind dropping the link into the chat for everybody? This is a list of books that we have published online that are great for talking to kids about different issues. Some of these books are very far removed, like A Mother for Choco, about a little bird who's looking for their mama. And some of them, like Dos Conejos Blancos or Two White Rabbits, which is pictured under available in Spanish. That book is very specifically about father and daughter who have been forced to migrate from one country to another. And it's told from the daughter's perspective of what's going on. And it's an incredibly beautiful book. And some of the pictures could be a little bit scary for young children. And so it's really, really important to preview the book ahead of time before you ever share it with a child. And it might be a really good book for parents to read to help them process some of the feelings and thoughts that they're going through. And it may or may not be one that they feel comfortable sharing with their child, depending on their developmental level, resilience, the level of experience of the trauma, et cetera, et cetera. So
And Chandra Gottschalk has just done a book around COVID-19 that's in English and Spanish, and we can make sure that we send out the link to those books. She's sending it out to everyone for free. So
yeah, that's online. That's a great one.
Yeah.
It's pretty long. And
Yep.
so
For
for
a
0
little
to
kid.
5-year-olds, it might be challenging. However, it is all black and white outline. So it could be a great coloring book, and you could take each page one at a time and talk about them on a different day. But we have a couple of Chandra Gottschalk's other books on here. Once I Was Very, Very Scared. And she has one called You Weren't With Me.
Yes.
And that is a really beautiful story about a parent and child bunny. And it's both very, very emotionally specific and covers a lot of different ways that separation could make people feel, but it's also very broad in terms of why that separation happened. So it could be applicable to a lot of situations. But this book list is divided up by topic. And so there's a section about incarceration, there's a section about forced migration, a lot of different types of experiences that our communities are familiar with are on this list. And we also are still building it constantly. So please feel free to contact me or contact Tandem if you've got a great book that you think we should add to the list. Let us know.
That's great. Thank you.
All right. And also there should be a handout that's got a list of even more books. And that handout that I sent in the packet has a lot of books that are really good just for talking about feelings that don't necessarily get into specific traumatic experiences. Okay.
Everyone will get those links, so don't worry about it, everyone. If you're registered, we'll be sending you those links.
So we're a little bit short on time, and we've had a couple of questions coming in throughout the last section. So I'm going to ask you if you've got questions now to write them down. And we're going to have a Q&A at the very end after we get through this last section. And I'll take all of your questions at that point. So if you've got a question specific to any of these strategies we just covered, please do write it down either in the chat and we'll address it later, or write it down for yourself and you can ask it at the end. But the last thing that I'd like to cover is something that someone mentioned in the first Q&A section, which is communicating with families. So we often think that it is bad to make assumptions. We talk a lot about how you should never make assumptions. However, I would contend that there are a handful of assumptions we can make about every family, and that is that they know their kids best. Families are defined all kinds of different ways. Whoever the family is, they know that child best. And they want what's best for that child. Even if their behavior doesn't always necessarily seem like it, families want their children to do well. We know that about all families. And they're already doing something really well. They're using some best practices. And we may need to do some real examining of our own biases and of the situation in order to find out what those best practices are. Families have the ability to learn and change, and they also have the ability to teach their child and to teach us. They have a lot that they can teach. So we know all of these assumptions to be true. However, if a family has recently experienced severe trauma and the parents are experiencing a lot of emotional overwhelm, based on what we've learned about the brain, there's one of these assumptions that might be temporarily impaired. So we're going to launch another poll. Can you mark which of these assumptions might be temporarily impaired when a family has experienced severe trauma? We've got about 20 people responded. Go ahead and find the poll on your screen. Interesting.
Okay, I'm going to close the poll in about 5 seconds.
Okay. All right. So we actually have quite a spread. And it's interesting because it's made me think a little bit about my assumptions. Families know their kids best. I would contend that generally speaking, even traumatized families know their kids best. There could be a situation in which that trauma has resulted in a separation and the family has been estranged from their child. So that would be a specific situation. For the most part, we agree that families still want what's best for their kids, although in a moment of trauma, there might be a lot of different areas of focus that are pulling on a parent in terms of what they're trying to achieve. But generally speaking, I think they still want what's best for their kids. They might slip in some of their best practices, but I would argue that they're already still using some best practices. Families have the ability to learn. We did talk about how the brain can go and grow and change, but in the moment of trauma, when we're way emotionally overwhelmed, that ability to learn is temporarily impaired, whether we're children or adults. The ability to stop and reflect and think about what I did, should have done, the decision I made, what I'm going to do next, that cerebral cortex that we really need for learning is going to be temporarily impaired. And then it's interesting, we have a lot of votes on families have the ability to teach. I would say that a family that has experienced something really traumatic could teach us a lot about what that's like and about where they're coming from and what they need and what they have that's working for them. I think that in the moment of trauma, actually the ability to teach might be increased. So the focus is really that this ability to learn, the ability to take new suggestions and hear from us, here are some things that you should probably try. That's going to be really, really challenged when a family is experiencing emotional overwhelm. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. And so an approach that we can use is to start with curiosity. And I kind of want to make this 10 bullet points and have the first 7 of them be start with curiosity. We want to lean into curiosity a lot longer than we think should be necessary, because it's very, very easy for a provider or an educator who has been trained on trauma and gone to school for this to walk in and say, well, this is a problem and here's the solution and why can't you take it? And I think we've all experienced that not working, whether it's with a family that we work with or with our own families in our own lives. Starting with curiosity, assuming that you don't fully understand the situation, and really, really focusing on understanding the situation as fully as possible, recognizing and affirming what you're hearing to show that you heard it is also really, really important. And that's one that's really challenging for me. I tend to hear people say things and then be like, yeah, I got it. And now here's my suggestion. But repeating back what you've heard or paraphrasing it is a really, really powerful way of making sure people understand that you did hear them, you did understand them, or if you didn't, it gives them an opportunity to correct you, which is really, really important. If you say, well, what I'm hearing is this, and they're like, that's not what I meant at all, then you can back up and go right back up to number one and go back to the curiosity, right? Once you've had a lot of back and forth with the first two, you may have built up enough trust to be able to offer new information. And offering new information is different from making a suggestion. It isn't saying you should, it's saying, I heard about this thing, do you think it might help? And then waiting and listening for them to respond and tell you whether it would or wouldn't. And then if they say it wouldn't help, we can go back to curiosity and we can find out more about what we were misunderstanding that we thought this information might be helpful, but it isn't. Okay, so this is obviously much easier said than done. And this is a pretty quick overview, but I do want to look at an example. And I'm wondering if I can have one volunteer who will unmute and read through this with me. Can I have one volunteer? If you can't unmute yourself, you could raise your hand that we practiced at the beginning, and Beth or Leah will unmute you.
Hi, Kelsey. My name is Laura. I'm happy to read with you.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. Okay, so why don't, Laura, will you please be the blue lines?
Sure.
And I will role play the green lines, and we're going to go through just this little conversation.
Sure. So how has Mila been doing since you moved out of the house?
She won't talk to me anymore. I think she thinks it's my fault.
That's really tough, especially because you have always been so close. What kind of things do you try to talk about?
I ask her if she wants to read or play with her toys, but she just stares at me. And then I try to ask her what's wrong, but she says she's fine.
Dang, that makes sense. It also sounds really frustrating. How do you feel about losing the house?
Obviously, I'm pissed.
Has Mila seen or heard you express that?
I don't want Mila to see me that way, so I tell her I'm fine.
And then do you want me to answer the question, what do I say next?
No, thank you so much, Laura. I would like everyone to answer the question, what would you say next, in the chat. What is the next thing that the person in blue might say in this conversation?
Okay, and just a reminder, when I launch the breakout rooms, it'll ask you if it's okay for you to go to the breakout room. If you would like to, go ahead and select, click yes or enter the breakout room. And if you have any questions, there's a way to contact the host and I can come and see if you need help. And before we close the breakout room, you'll get a little timer that will let you know that the breakout room is closing so you can finish your conversation.
Thank you so much. And before we go into that, before we launch those, I do want to ask, just for the next line, I see one person suggested, do you think she is aware of your feelings? Okay, we have a suggestion. Maybe you should tell her how you feel about it. Tell the parent that she should tell her child, tell her how you feel. I'm hearing a lot of suggestions. Can we go back to curiosity affirmation, maybe offering info? Let's see. She might benefit to know that you feel the same as her. So that's gentle, but it's still a suggestion. We're telling her to follow the child's lead. All of these are really, really good advice for Mila's mom. But I wonder if we say these things to her right now, when she's pissed, in her words, is she going to receive them and say, yeah, you know what? I think I will talk to my daughter about my feelings.
It's like that the feelings have to come out before information can go in for people.
I hear you're pissed. There's an affirmation. Oh, maybe she feels the same way you do. So that's a really interesting observation. And I think that's a really good way of offering new information, because rather than giving her advice, you're kind of drawing out that we have this issue where the daughter is saying I'm fine, and the mom is also saying I'm fine. But the mom is frustrated because the daughter won't tell her how she's feeling, and the child is frustrated because the mom won't tell her how she's feeling. But it's easier to see that when you're not in it. And if we tell the mom how to parent at this point, having exchanged only 4 sentences with her, then it's not very likely to be well received. I can understand how frustrating it all is for you and Mila, right? So there's an affirmation that's kind of drawing out the duality of it. So we're starting to get a lot of really interesting suggestions here. And so what I'd like you all to do is we're going to go into breakout rooms of 4 people for just a couple of minutes. And in your groups of 4, I would like you to brainstorm some more lines to this conversation. And so we can go with, you know, whatever someone wants to say next. Then let's try to think about what mom's response to that might be. So I would encourage you to really focus on curiosity and affirmation, because this is still the very beginning of a conversation. And we want to make sure that we're building trust with this mom, tapping into her emotions. Someone mentioned, work on building that trust. So we're going to break out into breakout rooms and see how many lines we can exchange without making any suggestions about what this mom should do. And then we'll come back and talk about how it went. All right. So as we mentioned, not sure how many people were here. The breakout rooms did not go as we had hoped, and we're coming up on time here. So what I would encourage you to do is take this example, and it is completely made up. It is not even based on real people, so there's no confidentiality. Any similarity to true events is purely coincidental. So please feel free to take that and do this exercise with your colleagues. Talk through a little bit, what are some responses you might have here, and what are some of the ways that you think mom might respond. Also, I'm going to share another resource with all of you that was developed by Head Start, and it's part of their family engagement training series. And it's an online simulation where you can actually sit in a conversation with a family and choose your own adventure. It pops up a bunch of different things you could say, and you choose one, and then the family reacts, and you get to watch it, and then you get to backpedal if you need to. And that is a really, really cool simulation, again, developed by Head Start, but really relevant to a lot of different contexts in which we work with families. So that will be shared out along with the handouts and the recording. But thank you all for your bravery and venturing out into those lonely, lonely breakout rooms. And we've got just a couple of minutes for final questions, and I will stay on a little longer if you have any further questions.
And I wanted to thank everyone for joining, and please be sure to fill out your application, your evaluation, so we know what other kinds of trainings you would like. If this was helpful to you, what other kinds of trainings around what other kinds of concerns around 0 to 5 are helpful to you. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for all the love in the chat box. Appreciated. And do feel free to drop in. How do we recommend support for parents without offending them? Yeah, so that's what that last exercise was about. And I'm going to really recommend that you look for that link to the Head Start simulation. But this idea of suggesting something that you've heard, offering some information, waiting to see how it lands and responding to that, not assuming that what you have to offer or your suggestion will be the thing that works for that family is so incredibly important. And it takes some real evaluating, why am I so sure that this thing is going to work? Has it worked for other families? Has it worked for me and my family? And what are the places where that is going to be similar for this family I'm talking to, and where it's going to be different? And this is where we get back to that assumption that families can teach us a lot. So it's really, really important when it comes to, you know, wanting to give families what they need, that we really are careful in finding out exactly what it is that they would like support with. Because even if this resource technically would help them if they're open to it, if they're not open to it, might as well not exist. And so building that trust through curiosity and affirmation is the most important thing we can do.
And you can use your own experience having worked with other families and saying, sometimes I have found that there are these kinds of things that are helpful. Sometimes I found this kind of thing. So you're more coming alongside rather than being in front, you know, telling them what to do, but sort of be a little thought partner with them around what might be helpful.
Right. And then following that up immediately with, is that going to work in this situation? Do you think? Is that realistic to you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Not, are you
People
going to do that? Because that could feel really loaded and like an accusation, but you know, does that seem like it might help? Because it worked for this other family that I met with last week. Right.
And sometimes we have to let go of fixing things. Sometimes we just have to listen and be a support.
Sometimes that's what's needed. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that, Beth. Rosalba, the resource from Head Start will come in an email. You might be able to find it just by Googling Head Start parent engagement simulation. But we will send that link out to everybody so that you're able to get to it directly.
Thank you everyone for attending. Want to honor, let's see, when people are asking when the recording will be provided, it'll be in this next week, and you get your certificate by completing your evaluation. There'll be a place that you can click on to get your certificate, but you must complete your evaluation. That helps us so much when you do.
And I'm going to put up these reference slides for a few seconds so that they show up on the recording as well. And you'll also get them in PowerPoint version for any of you who are so excited to go read some research.
Yeah, I see Maria trying to snap some pictures of these resources, and we'll be sure to send them. We'll be sure to send them to Maria.
All right.
Great. Perfect. I love it. No, it's great. I don't want to stress you out, but we'll make sure that you get them.
And here is our contact info. My email is kelsey@tandembayarea.org. So just like that info email, but with my first name.
All right, you're welcome. Everyone have a wonderful day.